Hello, friends. I'm doing an Instagram live about the Trump trial in New York City. Closing arguments just finished today. Let me see. I can't read without my glasses, you guys. I'm getting so old. What can I say? And I'm going to be talking to my friend Lisa Ferri. She is a senior producer, an Emmy award-winning journalist. Hi, everybody. Hi, Olivia Scott, 77, and Lillian Showalter in Capital Politics. Hi, everybody. Thank you. Hi. So basically, we haven't talked about the Trump trial at all, but closing arguments just finished. And so I thought it would be interesting to talk to my friend Lisa Ferri, who has been covering the trial, and she's been there every day since it started, to kind of hear what closing arguments were like and kind of really understand the mood of the courtroom. So I haven't done this for a while, you guys, so let me find Lisa.
Hi!
It worked. Hello.
It worked! Oh, I'm so happy to see you.
I'm happy to see you too, and I'm happy to talk to you about this trial because I think, unlike a lot of journalists who have had to report on it every day, there are a lot of people in this audience who haven't been following every machination or machination, depending on how you say that word. And you've been there every single day from the beginning, right, Lisa?
Yes, I have. And today was sort of this crescendo. It had this circus-like feeling because the line was longer than it's ever been since it began. And it just reminded you of the early days where we didn't quite know what to expect. And we were lining up at 4:50 in the morning outside. And once again today, we were there at 5 a.m. and it was crazy.
And you've been in the courtroom. Today you happen to be in the overflow room.
Yes.
And you were there with some interesting people, including Andrew Giuliani, Rudy Giuliani's son. Who else was in attendance today?
Dowdy was there today, but every day, increasingly, as the trial has gone on, you've seen more and more sort of familiar faces from both sides. Famous anchors on cable news on the one hand from, liberal places like CNN and MSNBC, but on the other hand, we've seen Andrew Giuliani. We had all of the Trump children were there today. Not all, Ivanka was not there, but Eric, Tiffany, Don Jr., Lara, Barron was not there. But so you've seen this sort of everyday sort of an assortment of people from both sides of the political spectrum. I was seated next to Jeffrey Clark, who was the official that Trump wanted to put into the Justice Department in the wake of January 6th. So every day, if you're very carefully looking around the overflow room, and if you're in the court, it's a real, it's everybody, every walk of life and every walk of, political stripe.
Right. And let's talk about today, because this was, as you said, the crescendo. It's closing arguments. Both the defense and prosecution delivered their closing arguments. Let's start with the defense. Basically, it all centered around Michael Cohen and how honest they are trying to, or dishonest, they're trying to convince the jury he is or was. Tell us about that.
Well, so it was so interesting. I think there was this expectation that maybe they would have more layers to the defense, but it was really kind of a one-note thing. It almost felt like if it were a word cloud, it would have been Michael Cohen and lie. It was a lot of coming back to this idea that this is a man who, lied to his family, lied to federal judges, lied to Congress, lie, can you believe him? And it felt, Todd Blanche, who is not an experienced defense attorney, he's an experienced prosecutor, but not an experienced defense attorney. And I feel like that was kind of on display because the pace of his closing argument was a little unusual. By which I mean, it wasn't a narrative story that built. It was sort of like this detail and then that detail and then this detail. And all of it sort of building to this idea that Michael Cohen cannot be believed and he was going rogue and he was freelancing here and Donald Trump didn't know. And if you're a fan of Law and Order, which I think most of us are, he has this tendency to sort of like sort of pound the desk and raise his voice when he wants to underscore something. But we were all sort of talking in the press room when we broke for lunch, when the defense had finished and we were waiting for the prosecution to raise their closing arguments, that you weren't quite sure what you were supposed to take away from it, what the larger idea was beyond Michael Cohen can't be believed.
In fact, some of the comments that I've read throughout the day from people like Maggie Haberman, I think of the New York Times, she agreed with your comment that it was very kind of meandering and all over the place. But I've also read that they didn't really offer an alternate story, you know, that would counter the prosecution's case.
Yes. It seemed like their strategy was, let's get one juror who has a doubt about something, and that will be the hung jury. Like, they're not quite going for an acquittal, it feels, because if you were really going for an acquittal, you would lay out, here's our version of what happened. And that's not quite what we got. The prosecution has done a really robust and meticulous job of saying, almost so granular that sometimes it really takes a long time, which is why we all just got out of court now as the sun is setting. A really granular, methodical story, a narrative that you can kind of roll along with. I like to say that, you know, when you're listening to the prosecution make their case today in closing arguments, but all along in the past 6 weeks, it feels like a Netflix true crime. Like, you can really follow along, and there's a narrative arc, and there's drama and tension building, and it just didn't feel that way, didn't land that way. And we don't know how the jurors are
for the defense. You're saying, but let's just talk about the prosecution, Lisa, for a second. He, on the other hand, this prosecuting attorney, Joshua Steinglass, from everything I've read, and of course I haven't been there like you have, but his closing argument was quite effective. Can you talk about that?
So he has this sort of, just his delivery is quite good. You know, you have to also think about the fact that just everybody's a human being. The press people have been in there all day, the jurors, it's a long day. This is the longest day we've had. And we've never gone past 5. And now here it is, you know, hours later. And he has this lovely way of sort of keeping you on your toes and sort of being very conversational. He kept, you know, throwing in Yiddish words like chutzpah and, you know, he was entertaining. So even if your eyes were glazing over a little bit with all the documents and the data, he would sort of snap you out of it. And I think that really was effective for the human beings who were on the receiving end of that. But he was able to pivot in the wake of the defense's closing arguments and sort of incorporate what they said. So he came out swinging, and he was like, you don't have to like Michael Cohen. You don't have to feel like you want to be his friend. You don't have to feel like you want to go into business with him. We did not walk down. We, the prosecution, did not walk down to the witness shop and pick him out of the window. That's Donald Trump. Donald Trump chose Michael Cohen because Michael Cohen was willing to lie and cheat and steal on his behalf. And so it's hypocritical, or how he put it was. So it takes some chutzpah for the defense to now say, you can't believe Michael Cohen for all of the qualities that made Donald Trump choose him in the first place as his right-hand man. And he made a really excellent point. You know, so much of this hinges on like these legal reimbursements. He said Michael Cohen wasn't his attorney meaningfully. He was his fixer. He was his tough guy. He didn't use the word underboss, but that's what it felt like from a mob movie, that he was the guy who would go and bully people and threaten to sue them and get things done. And when that's the kind of business you're in, those are the kind of witnesses you get. And the other point that he made was, so even if you don't like Michael Cohen, and what was, I think, probably not lost in the jury, certainly wasn't lost on us in the press room, is that so much of what Steinglass, the prosecutor, had to say today harkened back. It was like a callback to phrases he used in his opening arguments. Like he kept, in his opening arguments, he said.
Opening statements.
Oh, it's the opening statements. Yeah. Sorry, you're right. It's opening statements. You're right.
Yeah.
He said, documents don't lie and documents don't forget.
Well, I was going to ask you, Lisa, about that, because there are receipts, there are checks, multiple checks for $130,000, right? Or adding up to that.
Yeah, and then they grossed it up. And that's the sort of,
signed by Donald J. Trump. So is the defense basically claiming his motive was not to protect himself politically, but protect his family.
Well, in part, they're trying to make the case that he was trying to protect Melania and the family. And this is very interesting because the prosecution did a good job of taking that apart and sort of blowing it to smithereens. Because you had David Pecker, who testified and said,
Who, by the way,
before
who's the head of the National Enquirer, everyone, if you
head
haven't.
of the National
I
Enquirer.
always say the aptly named David Pecker, but go on.
Yes. And David Pecker, who importantly got on the stand and said, I love the man. He was my mentor. He's my friend. I miss him. And yet his testimony was damning. He said, for years, I was catching and killing these stories, although he didn't use that phrase. I was suppressing negative stories. I was pumping up positive stories. And he would mention that he was concerned about his family, but that all changed once he ran for president. And once he started running for president, he never mentioned the family again. He was only concerned about his campaign. And that's meaningful because that's coming from someone who considers himself Trump's friend. Hope Hicks had testimony that sort of corroborated that, saying, and this is, I don't know if you remember, this was a dramatic moment where Hope Hicks, who says he was the best boss I ever had. I loved working for him. And when she got up on the stand, there was this moment where she cried. Right before she cried, what the prosecution elicited from her was that this conversation that she said she had with Trump right in 2018, after the Stormy Daniels story did come out. And according to Hope Hicks, he said, aren't we glad this didn't come out right before the election? It came out now. And that she said his concern was the campaign, not the family. So you have these people who are saying, I love him, I'm on Team Trump, who are saying it wasn't about the family. It was about the campaign. And you have, Michael Cohen has said that, you have all these people corroborating them. So that's what they kept coming back to, is you don't have to like Michael Cohen. If you don't like Michael Cohen, look at the documents. If you don't like the documents, look at all the corroborating witness testimony from people who say, I want to work for Donald Trump again. And so they wove this really tight knit story about, like, choose your flavor of ice cream. You don't like Michael Cohen, you don't believe him, look at the documents. You don't like the documents, look at all of these corroborating witnesses who say, I am Team Trump. So that was one of the things that the defense was trying to argue, that he was really concerned about his family. And Steinglass at the very end had this kind of amazing moment. He was making the case that, just look at Stormy Daniels. Stormy Daniels' story, he started his closing arguments by saying, I get it. Maybe you think I don't care that Donald Trump allegedly had a sexual encounter with a porn star a decade before the election. I don't care. However, the American people have a right to know that, because that's the sort of foundation of democracy, that it can't be three people in a room who get to decide what the voters know before they cast their vote. The foundation of democracy is that we all deserve to know everything and have access to accurate information. So he circled back around to that at the very end, and he said, Stormy Daniels' story was kind of out there kicking around. He only felt motivated to buy her life rights once he was running for president. And what does that tell you? When Stormy Daniels' story could have hurt Melania and the family, he wasn't motivated to hand over the money. He suddenly got very motivated to pay all that money once, in the wake of the Access Hollywood story tape coming out right before the election. And that tells you what his motivation was. And at that point, you had Tiffany Trump, Don Jr., Eric Trump, and Lara Trump sitting in the front row behind their dad. And I wasn't in the court, but the New York Times reporters said that at that moment, when Steinglass made that point, all the kids looked up. They had been looking at their phone and they heard, oh, he wasn't thinking about the family, he was thinking about the campaign. It got their attention. But the other thing that the really salient point he made about Stormy Daniels, to my mind, is he said, think about October 2016. You're a couple weeks away from this election. The Access Hollywood tape comes out. This is, he had a great analogy. Hope Hicks had testified that at the time that the Access Hollywood tape came out, there was a Category 4 hurricane barreling down, and that the Access Hollywood tape was such bigger news that nobody covered the hurricane. And Steinglass said, so you could say the Access Hollywood tape was not a blip, like the defense would like you to think. It was a Category 5 hurricane. That's how big it was. And in the wake of that, Trump's defense, allegedly concocted by Melania, was to say it was just words. It was just locker room talk. Think about Stormy Daniels. Then Stormy Daniels comes around, and Stormy Daniels, I think he said, is the walking, talking embodiment and proof that it wasn't just words. That you had on that tape, that Access Hollywood tape, a presidential candidate saying he feels entitled to grab women by their genitals. And then shortly thereafter, you have Stormy Daniels with a story that shows it isn't just talk, it's not just words, it's not that easily dismissed. According to Stormy Daniels, it happened. And that was the escalation of the crisis in the wake of the Access Hollywood tape right before the election that, according to Steinglass and the prosecutors, was the reason. She was the motive. Keeping Stormy's story quiet was the motive, and keeping it away from the voters.
But for everyone listening, what is that exactly is the crime? Excuse me, is the crime here, Lisa? What is he being charged with? Because he's not being charged for having an affair with Stormy Daniels. He's being charged for election interference, or what exactly it is.
It's sort of we're gonna find out the exact wording tomorrow on jury instructions, and you're right. And the prosecution will say it doesn't matter if what Stormy's version of events is true or not. It does not matter. And you don't need to believe her or not. And we don't even need to know whether if Stormy's story had come out, whether that would have tipped the election. We don't need to answer any of those questions. It's the
or further
unlawful
tip the election, right?
Further tip the election, right? It's the unlawful campaign. It's a campaign finance violation, and then the papering over of that through business records. And so it's a little wonky, but essentially it means that there was a conspiracy to conceal another crime. And the underlying crime was a company isn't allowed to make a campaign finance contribution like that without announcing it. You have to be transparent about that. And then on top of it is this vast conspiracy. And that's why this is a documents case. There's a lot of paper. At one point, Steinglass said, you got to get ready to roll up your sleeves and go through a lot of paper. And for weeks now, we've just been seeing invoice, check stub, voucher. It's the paper trail, right? And that is the thing that those two things in conjunction is what kicks us up from a misdemeanor to a felony. And, there were some interesting moments throughout where both sides kind of crossed the line and got reprimanded by Judge Marchand, who is, I like to say, is biblical. He's like a biblical character. He is so kind and measured, and it hurts my heart that Americans couldn't see this with their own eyes. They just have to take our word for it. But today, at the end of closing arguments, Steinglass made this point. He said he was pleading with the jurors. He said, now it's your turn. In America, we get to 12 jurors of his peers. You saw the witnesses, you saw the evidence, you get to decide if you're going to hold him accountable, because there aren't special rules depending on how powerful you are. It's not true that Donald Trump can walk down Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody. And it was like, objection sustained, because you're not, right. That's very, you're not allowed to say that. But then it's in the jury's minds, and it's something, and you sort of got, gasps and laughs, because that was like, whoa, what did you just do? But earlier in the day, when Todd Blanche, the lead defense attorney, was closing, he, at the very end, when he was addressing the jurors, he said, and you can't send someone to prison on something like this. And it was like, objection sustained, because, of course, Donald Trump is a first-time offender. This is a nonviolent crime. There is no reason to believe there would be, and the person who decides if there is a conviction, the person who makes that decision is Judge Marchand. And so if you've been following, you've been seeing there've been these moments where these like explosions and like they send the jury out and like there's really real tension. And that happened today after Todd Blanche said to the jury, well, you can't send him to prison on something like this, because they sent the jury out before we went to lunch, and the judge was like, I have trouble believing that was accidental, and Todd Blanche, you're an experienced prosecutor. You know that was over the line. And, you know, Judge Marchand.
Well, I have a question, Lisa. I have a question. So he couldn't be sent to prison for this?
I mean, technically, theoretically, he could.
But it's unlikely.
I guess it's unlikely. I mean, first, it's going to be appealed no matter what. But he's a first-time nonviolent offender. So, you know, that raises all kinds of questions about what it would look like, what punishment would look like. I don't know that. I'm not a lawyer. But, you know, it's a very provocative word to drop. It's like a little bomb to drop into the jury, like you can't send him to prison. Well, nobody's talking about prison yet. Like that's a way down the line.
Let me ask you, because you had a front row seat practically during this whole trial, what was Donald Trump's demeanor during it? You know, there were reports that he was falling asleep during some of the technical minutia. But in general, like, what was his affect in the last few days?
You know, I'm going to forget the name of the mobster that he said he really looked up to, but he said he admired, maybe it was Gotti or one of the mobsters when he was on trial, like how he comported himself and that he never let anyone in the court see that he was afraid, and he was sort of like macho about it. And I feel like that's what we got. You know, he would stride in, he would look around to see who was there. You know, it's hard not to think that when there was a period when the defense was making their case where they sort of name checked certain journalists like Maggie Haberman, you know, he sort of has a beef with Maggie, and like it's hard not to think that he saw Maggie in the courtroom and wanted to drag her a little bit, because it did feel like the defense at times were specifically maybe carrying out things that they felt their client would want. So he did have this sort of show no weakness. That's what it felt like. Show no weakness, commanding. However, and look, I'm conflicted about it. Yes, he closed his eyes a lot. That said, this was very physically taxing. I think we all were very, very tired. And I think at a certain point, after the first couple of days where there was press about the fact that he was falling asleep, I think he actually closed his eyes on purpose. I don't know that he was necessarily asleep. I think he, at times, I think he fell asleep and you could see him sort of jerk awake. But again, far be it for me to criticize him or anyone about that, because this has been very physically taxing. But I think that strategically, he was almost sort of signaling to the jury that I'm above this and I'm going to close my eyes and I'm not even going to engage, because there was a lot of that.
That brings me to the jury. Could you see how they were reacting? And in general, you kind of get a sense of what the jury's like. And I don't know, maybe you don't. I'm not a lawyer either. But can you give us any observations about what the jury was doing during the course of this trial?
Now, again, I was in the overflow room most of the time, which was great. Actually, in some ways, I likened it to the difference between having like a front row seat next to a sporting event or seeing it on high def. Like you have a little bit more freedom in the overflow room. But what we know, it's 7 men, 5 women, 2 lawyers, which I think is going to be sort of pivotal because so much of this is sort of technical legal stuff, but also understanding Michael Cohen in context and understanding how deeply anomalous his behavior was as a lawyer. Like that's not what lawyers do. And so it sort of speaks to how strange their relationship was and how Michael Cohen was being deployed. But we know they're smart. We know at the end of the day, both sides, the defense and the prosecution, spent a fair amount of time complimenting them and saying, you were here on time every day. You took copious notes. I can tell you're paying attention. Like they were super engaged, which is great. And I think says that no matter what the outcome is, we can all take, you know, solace in the fact that we can trust this jury and they'll do the right thing in terms, whatever that is, whatever they decide that is.
A lot of people are thinking there's going to be a hung jury. Of course, you've heard that, you know, just takes one juror to think there's reasonable doubt, and then a mistrial will be declared, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So,
yeah.
So, is that what the defense team is counting on?
We don't know, and we don't know how the jury is internalizing it, but given how sort of one note the defense's closing arguments were today, it seems like that's how they're shooting their shot here. Like it wasn't carefully threaded together like a story, as I was saying before, which feels like they're just sort of throwing spaghetti against the wall in the hopes that maybe one of the jurors will be like, yeah, well, that one detail that Todd Blanche raised, can't get that out of my head, so I can't convict on that one. But look, my understanding is, look, there are 34 counts. It's possible that they'll convict on some subset of those and acquit on others. And I think that there are some of the charges, particularly the ones involving the checks with Donald Trump's name on them, that, arguably have more heft and momentum behind them. But I think that the thing that stands out to me about the jury is that the first week where they were choosing the jury, the voir dire, as they call it, the jury selection, was so emotional. Like, you had these multiple people showing up and sort of getting kind of far down the path of almost being chosen and then just saying, I can't do it. It was very relatable and human. They were like, I'm too anxious.
Right. Well,
And
I think there were a lot of fears that the jurors would be harassed and
absolutely. And one, at least one, was the oncology nurse who was the second juror seated, and she was sort of a standout. Like, she was just a delight and cared about her patients, and within 24 hours of being seated, she had been referenced, not name checked, on Fox News, and there was this whole hubbub, and she showed up the next day and said to the judge, I don't think I can serve. And Judge Marchand was very frustrated by that. He said, we just lost what could have been a great juror. And so I think, and after that, especially in the last day of voir dire, where they were seating the last alternates, there were multiple people who broke down in tears, which was a little just surprising.
Well, it is it is a big spotlight and a lot of attention and pretty nerve-wracking for people, I'm sure.
Absolutely. And that's why it's all the more notable that here we are at the end and nobody dropped out. I think a lot of us in the press wondered if, given how high the emotions were that first week during jury selection, if sometime during the whole span of the trial, someone would drop out, someone would say, I got a threat, I got a suspicious phone call. No. And I would say this. The other thing I would say about the jury is that they appear to be very cohesive. Like, if someone sneezes, they'll all say, God bless you. They're very polite with one another. And I mean, look, we feel that in the press pool, you're seeing the same people every day. And it's a little bit like the boys on the bus. Like, you're all bonded. You're all waiting out there. We get there at 5 and 5:30 in the morning. We're waiting out there 3 hours. Like, you feel kind of bonded, connected to everybody. And you can only imagine that these folks feel the same. And I don't know how that will intersect with how they choose to make this decision. But given that the specter of a hung jury hangs over these deliberations so much, I am curious how the fact that they seem to get along very well and trust one another will play in terms of them coming to a unanimous decision.
So what happens now? The closing arguments are done.
Yeah.
Judge Marchand insisted on getting it done today, despite the fact that it was a very long day. So what happens now, Lisa, tomorrow, for example?
So tomorrow morning at 10, we're starting a little bit later than usual. Judge Marchand is having the jury come in, and there's going to be about an hour and a half of what's called jury instructions. And this is really important. Actually, last Friday, time is no meaning. One day last week, after the jury left, was dismissed. We watched as both sides sort of arm wrestled over what those jury instructions will be. And it's really important because it's essentially setting the bar and giving them the contours of how you can decide yes or no, convicted, hung jury, acquitted. And so we don't even know yet what those jury instructions are. Both sides do, but we don't know the full scope of that. So I'll be curious to hear that. And then that should be pretty short. And then they get the case for deliberations. And so what that's going to look like for the press is we'll wait online and go in and listen to the jury deliberations as we have been. And then they go off and we sit there. Because if there's a verdict, it'll be a little bit like a fire drill and you want to just be there and ready to hear whatever it is. So it's, this sort of
any thoughts through the press corps about how quickly they may come to a decision or not?
Nobody knows. But here's what we were chattering about, especially after, first of all, there's just a tsunami of data and evidence, but they've really been marinating in it for a while. And it's hard not to believe that they've been thinking about it. And especially they just had a week off, which they haven't had. They just had like a clear week to go back to their lives. And as a human being, and this is just me fully speculating, like you go back to your life and you're like, well, I might be ready to go back to my life properly. I have kids. And for instance, tonight, we stayed so late and Judge Merchan was, kept saying, thank you so much for everybody on the jury made accommodations. They got a babysitter. They got the grandma to come and whatever they did to take care of their family obligations, they all did that. These people have lives and they have to get on with it. Now, that's not to say that they'll necessarily come right back, but you can imagine as a human being that there's some impetus to move swiftly.
And have they been instructed, I should know this, but have they been instructed not to read anything or to pay attention to social media, et cetera? Because it's pretty unavoidable.
Every day. And Judge Merchan every day says, please keep an open mind. Please don't Google it. Stay off social media. Don't read about it. And, who knows? It feels like a serious jury that takes their obligation very seriously and takes this moment very seriously. They're up to the task, but we don't know. Yeah, we assume. We don't know. But, I mean, it's like such a suspenseful moment now. And it was such a long day, which I guess feels fitting because this has been, just building. Every week has been more dramatic than the next.
One quick question before I let you go, Lisa, because I'm sure you're exhausted and you have to get up tomorrow and go back there. But, there was sort of a dog and pony show that started pretty regularly with members of Congress, Republican members of Congress, who were basically speaking on former President Trump's behalf to the press, kind of having their own, trying to use it as a press conference opportunity. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious how people thought about that. I know a lot of them got criticism for, at least in some publications, saying, why aren't they actually doing their jobs in DC versus coming up and pontificating about this trial. And then I know Robert De Niro came today, enlisted, I guess, by the Biden campaign to kind of do the same thing, unless he did it on his own.
I don't know. And what's interesting about that is we would see reports about this after we got out of court because we would be locked inside and all these things. For instance, when you go to the court, there's sort of a line, this. It's like, NBC and CBS, and it's all in a line. And these folks would sort of set up their press conferences right next to us. So we had sort of a bird's eye view. But if you weren't there when they happened to be doing it, you didn't see it. So we would sometimes just read about it. I caught a press conference last week with Don Jr. and Matt Whitaker. Remember Matt Whitaker? He was the acting AG who came up with the masculine toilet. Remember that guy? And Pam Bondi from Florida. And that was really interesting, and they sort of wear similar clothes, and that's a little strange. But there's definitely been.
And Mike Johnson came, and I mean, there were all kinds of Republicans who, I guess, took the train to New York and to stand by their man, I guess.
That's right. And what I would say with, because I didn't witness most of these live, and most of the people covering it didn't because we were in the court, and they sort of lock you in the room. I don't know if you knew this, but when you're covering it, they actually kind of have to lock you in the room because they don't want you like wandering around and bumping into a juror or whatever. So we didn't have a lot of freedom. But to me, the most interesting part of what you're raising is this. You have these incredibly strict gag orders going on where we spent considerable time with both sides wrangling over, did Donald Trump or did he not violate the gag orders, and what are the fines, and this incredibly dramatic moment at one point a couple of weeks ago where basically Judge Merchan said, if you do it again, I will not hesitate to put you in jail, right? This is a showdown. But one workaround, arguably, is to get people who support you to go to a microphone and say the thing you cannot say. And then that puts the judge in an even trickier position, because at what point do you say, well, that's in and of itself its own kind of violating the gag order, and you have to be incredibly careful and thoughtful about not slowing down the whole proceeding in the name of getting sidetracked
So,
by this. And so
the judge allowed that to happen.
yeah. And, we didn't see it escalate into like super direct attacks on witnesses and this chilling effect, but it could have gone there. And that would have been a really sticky spot. We were all wondering, because with each day, there'd be a new sort of cast who would show up and go to the microphones. And you could see them tiptoeing around saying, they were sort of, using their bully pulpit to say the things that Donald Trump could not. And what's the tipping point? When does the judge have to say,
But he didn't. He allowed it to go on. And speaking of the judge, I thought it was so disconcerting that he got so many death threats. Tell me about the security that he had to arrange after all these death threats. And did he talk about that at all?
No, and I don't know that much about the security he needed. I do know that I'm aware of the reports that he got death threats. But like, I'll give you an example. What you've probably seen the pictures when Stormy Daniels was entering and leaving the courthouse. She had to have a huge bulletproof vest on underneath. Like, all of these folks, I think, feel not incorrectly like there's danger, right? And Judge Merchan has just, again, I can't say it enough. It hurts my heart that there weren't cameras or at least audio in this courtroom. And I know that has to do with New York state law, because Judge Merchan is a hero. I mean, he would be, who was the guy who landed the plane on the Hudson? He would be like that.
Sully Sullenberger.
Right. He's Sully Sullenberger worthy of Americans' respect. And, the spin that you get about how he's conflicted, he's lovely. Takes such good care of this jury, and he seems incredibly selfless. To the extent that there have been threats against him, he didn't bring it up. He's only concerned about the sanctity of the proceedings and the safety and security and ease of the jurors. And I mean, I don't think we can, for anyone who living through these times is questioning, like, where are we with the rule of law? Are we going to survive this moment? People like Judge Merchan give you hope.
I think you should sign up and be his agent. Anyway, Lisa, I'm going to let you go. I hope this was helpful to everyone who's listening. This was really about atmospherics and strategy. Lisa is not a lawyer, although she could be. And I really appreciate you kind of talking us through some of this, and it'll be fascinating to see what happens. I think this is, a lot of political strategists say this has actually helped Donald Trump raise money and become more popular. We live in a pretty crazy world, but he is capitalizing on this, and of course delaying some of the other legal actions that are scheduled to be against him. It's just crazy.
Yeah, I would add just one thought. I think, again, if only Americans could see this, for the people who are frustrated that the other court cases have been delayed, just this case taking place is its own form of accountability. And to your point, even after we have the verdict, this story is far from over, because it's going to sort of send ripple effects into the political sphere, and we don't know what that's going to look like.
I don't know. It seems like Donald Trump survives everything, and not only survives it, but exploits it to his advantage. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. Lisa, thank you, and I'll see you soon, I hope.
Thanks for having me on.
Get some rest.
I will.
Okay,
Bye,
and
guys.
thanks, everyone. Okay, bye.